What is up, guys? You already know what it is. Thank you for tuning in today. Quick thank you for the tremendous support on my last video. Really means a lot to me. It really shows me that you guys are enjoying my content. You already know, new video every Thursday. Anyways, let's get into the topic of today's very lovely video. We're going to be discussing all of the, or I shouldn't say all, or at most of the killer techs that were removed from the game. And I am going to be leaning on your guys' support to let me know what killer techs I'm missing from this list, and I'll be making a part 2. But without further ado, let's get into what an actual tech is as we define it in this video. So firstly, we're going to define a tech as any unintended mechanic that was coded in the game and is used by killers to essentially get downs on survivors, traverse the map, anything. Any unintended mechanic that was coded into the game. Secondly, it must involve some sort of skill expression from the killer side. So a good example of this would be back in the day when the spirit didn't have a vaulting animation. She could just basically wait out a window and pretend like she was going to vault it. Now, when she would do that, survivors would think that she's vaulting the window because she had no animation, and then when they would come around, she would just do a basic M1. But that didn't really involve any skill expression on the killer's end, so things like that we're not really going to be counting as techniques. Last but not least, it shouldn't be any kind of normal movement strategy from the killer. So what does this mean? For example, Wraith's 99% uncloak out of pallet, or the Billy's curve mechanic. I just looked down at my notes and completely missed that. Or Billy's curve mechanic. Those things are just kind of normal movement strategies that are built into the killer's base kit. So for our ranking of each tech, we're going to be using 3 factors to analyze the effectiveness of the tech, the difficulty to pull it off, and we're going to be making an ultimate decision as to whether it should have been removed from the game or kept. Starting off at number 1 with everyone's favorite and very recently removed actually, which is the Blight's hug tech. So how did this technique work and what was it? Essentially, when the Blight would look down at a certain angle when he was against a wall or car, very fun to do it against a car, he would essentially not register with whatever wall he was trying to impact with, and he would glide against the wall, allowing him to essentially curve corners, or in some very nutty cases, do a full 180 around a car back in the day. It was a very fun technique. In terms of the counterplay for both sides, there was counterplay. People were used to the hug tech, and they anticipated, based on how the Blight was playing during the match, they could tell whether the Blight was able to pull it off or not, and the survivors could predict it quite well. So in terms of counterplay, there was good counterplay from the survivor, and it was actually quite fun when you dodged a hug tech. So it was fun for both sides, the survivor and the killer. In terms of the difficulty to pull off, I'd say in the beginning, when the Blight first came out, people found it much more difficult to pull off. People weren't really used to the concept of a hug tech. You know, nowadays we have a bunch of killers with hug techs like Wesker. I don't know if you would consider Chucky's hug tech, but we have a bunch of killers with hug techs now, and people are used to it. And it was quite difficult to pull off back in the day, but in more recent history, people got accustomed to it, and it was much easier to pull off and very fun when you did, and actually very effective and powerful at around certain loops and against good survivors. Lastly, this tech, should it have been removed? I don't think so. This tech essentially, the removal of this tech essentially reduced the Blight's overall skill floor. Now the meta to play Blight is to just ping pong really fast against obstacles, and everyone refers to him as having a glue trap stuck to his feet or his hands, and it is quite depressing that they removed it. I don't think they should have. There was good counterplay for both sides, and it made chases much more interesting. Next up, we have the Nurse with the Blink Fatigue Cancel tech. Essentially, what this tech allows you to do is swing right before you go and succumb to fatigue. You basically swing, and there are 2 advantages to this. 1, you don't look down, so you can see your surroundings and where the survivor is running to. And 2, if the survivor doubles back in you, you could actually swing to them, and they would just think that you're going into fatigue, but little did they know, they just got hit. The counterplay to this is very little. I highly doubt a lot of people knew about this back when it was a thing. I think about 4 or 5 years ago now. So it was quite unfair for survivors because they were just simply unaware that it was a thing. The difficulty to pull off was actually very hard from what I've heard. I haven't pulled this off myself, but I have seen streamers pull this off as the nurse, and it is quite a narrow window in terms of the timing. Essentially, you got to click M1 right before you succumb to fatigue, and then you'll just swing and not look down. Should this have been removed? Yes, definitely. This, I even recall it was a bannable offense. I'll probably have some B-roll of, I think it was Super Alpha that was showing this off, and apparently it was a bannable offense, and I could see why. It's kind of busted two huge advantages for the best killer in the game, so I'm glad that it was removed. Next up, we have a very recent tech that was only live in the PTB for Kaneki the Ghoul's release, and that would be the window slide tech. I don't really know what people call this, but I'm going to call it the window slide, and I have actually pulled this off, and I'm quite sad that they removed this. Essentially what this was is when you were at any window, and this worked quite well at Shack just due to the setup of Shack, but when you were at a window and you essentially grappled to beyond the window and then looked either to the right or to the left right before you hit the window, instead of jumping through the window, the game would take you to the fastest path to where you connected with your tentacle. So I'm sure I have some B-roll playing here, but essentially it would allow you to maneuver around an obstacle or an edge and basically catch survivors off guard. The counterplay to this, I think if they let it live a little bit and survivors got used to this, then survivors would be able to anticipate this. And I'm always an advocate for a higher skill ceiling for killers and survivors, because the more techniques you have in the game, the more skill expression, the more skill expressive you could be on both sides, right? You don't want to just have a killer that's one-dimensional, and no one likes when chases are predictable and one-dimensional like that, because that's the whole point of the game. People play for nice chases, right? They don't play to be gen simulated. In terms of the difficulty to pull this off, I wouldn't say it was very difficult. I was able to pull this off on my first try, even in actual chases against real people. It was very fun to pull off, and it certainly caught survivors off guard. In terms of this tech being removed, I personally don't think it should have been removed. Yes, there is a very hot topic of Kaneki being nerfed and a little overtuned right now, and I am in agreement with that. He is very overtuned, but a technique like this should not have been removed. Again, it lowers the skill the skill ceiling of a killer when they remove techniques like this. Our next entry is going to be talking about flicks, and this technique applies to a multitude of killers. That would be Chucky when he first came out, Oni, the Blight. The Blight has a bunch of flicks. He could do a J flick, he could do a S flick. It is quite sad to see how relatively one-dimensional his gameplay is nowadays, but back in the day he could do a lot of crazy stuff. And lastly was the Billy. The Billy could actually flick with his chainsaw even before his overheat rework. Skilled Billies could actually very quickly on very high DPI flick their mouse and get some crazy angles on the Billy's chainsaw. And essentially what this mechanic was is it allowed the killer to, any killer that had some kind of linear momentum power that would either down the survivor or injure them, essentially rather than being able to just hit them at a 0-degree angle or a 90-degree angle, they could actually flick to go beyond 90 degrees. In most cases, it was a 180-degree with Oni, it was a 180 with Chucky, Blight was just a 720, and Billy, I believe it was a 180 as well. And it is quite depressing that they removed these. The counterplay for these techniques was very doable for survivors, and it was actually quite satisfying when a survivor would dodge one of these, because you would anticipate it, you would see it coming, you would know that the killer is going to pull it off depending on how he was playing throughout the match, and when you did, it was quite satisfying to do. So there was counterplay to it if you predicted it correctly. The difficulty to pull off, so how most killers would do this, specifically Chucky and Oni I could speak to, would be you would have to kind of, when you're about to hit hit them with when you're running, you would have to look up at an angle and then over, so kind of like a U shape. I'm doing some actions with my hands, but you can't see them. It would kind of be like a up and to the side shape, right? If you would just flick to the side, you wouldn't get that full reach of an angle, but if you looked up and over, it's kind of like you're crossing this invisible barrier to Narnia, you know what I'm saying? Billy, you just have to be on some nutty DPI settings to do this. So going to should have been removed. Yeah, I think some of them were kind of nutty. Like back very recently when Chucky could do his flicks, he was pretty overtuned at the time. But when he could do his flicks, that was just the icing on the cake. I think that should have been removed. That was a very overtuned flick. Oni flicks, I think, were a bit harder to pull off, and I don't think they should have been removed. Blight is a whole separate topic. They butchered my boy, R.I.P. Blight. Billy, he is very powerful nowadays, and he could honestly, his curve window got increased as well, and I think he's in a great position. So the Billy flick is a bit outdated knowledge, but good to know regardless. Moving on to the Xenomorph's tail tech. Unfortunately, my boy Xenomorph is the target of behavior nowadays. He's just getting nerfed and nerfed into oblivion. Essentially, what this technique used to be is when you were very close to a survivor, if you were trying to moonwalk as the Xenomorph, there were a lot of scenarios you could pull this off at, but essentially it was when you would hit a survivor that was behind you. So directly behind you in your vicinity, you could actually use your tail whip and it would connect with the survivor and give them a damage state or down them depending on their health. The counterplay to this, you know, there was a counterplay to it. It's a very tight window to actually hit your tail. You could do a drag tech, but that's still in the game, so we're not going to mention that. But yeah, there was counterplay to this. You could just simply not be next to the Xeno. The difficulty to pull off, it was quite difficult. You had to land yourself in a perfect position such that the survivor was essentially on your ass. The advantages of this would be during a moonwalk, you could use your tail attack and the survivor would not expect it, and then obviously the tail attack has a lesser cooldown than a normal M1, so it would be worth it to the risk to reward ratio would be there. Should this have been removed? I don't really think so. They've been picking on Xenomorph lately for absolutely no reason. No one's been complaining about him. They just like to pick on some killers at certain points in time. I don't think this should have been removed. It wasn't that prevalent. It was relatively niche to pull off, and it wasn't overpowered at all. Next up, we have the Wolf Hug Tech with Dracula. Now, this was very short-lived, and this is actually quite an interesting one. So in the PTB, and I believe very shortly after release, what you could actually do with the Wolf was similar to Blight's Hug Tech. You could essentially Hug Tech a wall or any kind of obstacle such that when you're powering up your Wolf form, you would essentially glide and not collide with that wall and stop like you do nowadays. You could essentially glide on it, and it would give you advantage around short loops and even some medium to long loops. Now, there is one caveat to this. The Wolf form was very weak upon release, and then they buffed it a lot and gave it a bit of extra distance intermittently when you're doing your first to second jump, and at that time, the Hug Tech was still a thing. Now, that was quite busted. If the Wolf form was in its weaker state upon release, or even in the PTB, I would be completely down for this Hug Tech to be there. However, the Wolf Tech is very powerful. I would argue probably Dracula's most powerful form, actually his bat form is. But it is a very powerful form he has, and I think it was correct of them to remove this. It was not difficult to pull off at all compared to other Hug Techs like the Blight's Hug Tech or the Wesker Hug Tech, and I think it was a good decision that they removed this and buffed the Wolf in other ways. Last but not least, we have everyone's favorite, the Billy Sky Tech. Now, this was a technique that was very fun to watch and very fun to pull off. Essentially what it was is certain points in the map at certain obstacles, when the Billy would rev his chainsaw and collide with it, it would just send him flying up into the sky, hence the name Sky Billy. And what survivors would do, or sorry, what killers would do, Billies would do, is they would wait up on strategic obstacles such as the main house in a map and prey on survivors like a hawk and then boom, shred them in the air when they see them after he gets on top of whatever structure he's on. And it was very, very fun. The counterplay to this was absolutely none. You would just see a flying chainsaw coming down at you and you would be down on the floor. However, you would laugh and be like, wow, I just got skybillied, so it was kind of worth it, not gonna lie. The difficulty to pull this off, if you knew the spots, it wasn't that difficult, but if you were just a casual Billy trying to play and pull this off, it was relatively difficult. Should this tech have been removed? Absolutely not, behavior. What are you doing by removing these techs? Removing the fun in Dead by Daylight and making skull merchants of all things. Like, what are you guys doing, man? What are you guys doing? Put this technique back. Put Sky Billy's back in the game, and I will give you a thumbs up. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed that video and found it useful. Definitely look forward to part 2, and I think I'm actually going to be making a video for all the killer techs that are currently in the game. That will be a bit more lengthy, but I think it'll be worth it. Anyways, guys, if you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing if you did enjoy it and you want to see more of me speak about Dead by Daylight. Anyways, have a good day.